6 months had passed since the humiliating meeting at Council World, and Jake Morrison found himself staring at reports that made his blood run cold. The Crixth Hive was expanding again, and this time they were moving toward human space like a swarm of locusts, looking for fresh crops to devour. The insect aliens had been quiet since the council meeting, but intelligence reports showed massive fleet movements, heading directly for human colonies. Jake sat in his office aboard the newly constructed Orbital Defense Station Alpha, reading dispatch after dispatch from the frontier worlds. The colonists were scared and had every right to be. The Crixth H had never been stopped by any species they encountered. They would arrive at a planet, demand surrender, and then absorb the entire population into their hive mind. Those who refused to join willingly were simply eliminated. Commander. Rick Sullivan entered the office without knocking, his face grim as he carried another stack of reports. The military had been tracking Crixth movements for weeks, and the picture was getting worse by the day. Rick dropped the papers on Jake's desk and pointed to a star map on the wall where red dots showed enemy positions. The Crixth H were using a standard conquest pattern that had worked for them thousands of times before. They would send scout ships to study their target, then arrive with overwhelming force to crush any resistance before it could organize. After victory, they would set up breeding facilities to increase their numbers and move on to the next target. It was efficient, ruthless, and had never failed. Rick explained that the Hive was bringing more ships than they had ever used for a single campaign. Long-range sensors detected over 10,000 vessels of various sizes, from small scout craft to massive breeding ships that could carry millions of warrior drones. The Crixth were not taking any chances with humanity, even though they considered humans barely worth the effort. On the frontier world of Haven's Rest, Mayor Dan Cooper was holding an emergency town meeting in the community center. 3,000 colonists had gathered to hear what their government planned to do about the approaching threat. Dan was a big man with calloused hands who had helped build this settlement from nothing. But now he felt small and helpless, facing an enemy that could destroy everything he had worked for. Amy Rodriguez stood beside Dan wearing the brown uniform of Colonial Security. She had been a Marine before coming to Haven's Rest, and her job was to keep the colonists safe from raiders and wild animals. But the Crixth H were neither raiders nor animals. They were an alien war machine that had conquered half the galaxy. Amy had 40 security officers and maybe 200 civilian volunteers who could handle weapons. It should have been laughable, but nobody was laughing. Dan addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across the packed hall. He told them the truth because these people deserved to know what was coming. The Crixth H would arrive in approximately 3 weeks. Earth had been contacted for military support, but help was months away, even if it came at all. The Galactic Council had been asked to intervene, but their response was cold and predictable. Amy read the Council's official message aloud, and the words stung like acid. The Council stated that humanity had been warned about expanding too quickly into areas they could not defend. They said the Crixth H had legitimate claims to the systems they were entering, and that humans should have considered the consequences before establishing colonies so far from their home world. The message ended with advice for humans to evacuate or surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed back on Earth. Dr. Linda Hayes was working 18-hour days in her laboratory, trying to find some weakness in Crixth biology that could be exploited. She had managed to obtain tissue samples from previous Crixth victims and was studying them under every type of microscope and scanner available. General Pete Collins visited her lab daily, hoping for some miracle that could save human colonies. Linda's research was revealing disturbing facts about their enemy. The Crixth H had evolved for warfare over millions of years. Their warrior drones had redundant organs, meaning they could survive injuries that would kill most other species. Their exoskeletons were harder than steel and could deflect energy weapons that would vaporize normal creatures. Their nervous systems were connected to the hive mind, so they never panicked or made mistakes in battle. Dr. Sam Burton worked in the lab next door, analyzing Krixith technology and tactics. Sam had studied every battle the insect aliens had ever fought, and the pattern was always the same. They would arrive with superior numbers and technology, overwhelm their enemies with coordinated attacks, and accept surrender when resistance collapsed. No species had ever inflicted significant casualties on them, because no species had ever found a way to hurt them effectively. General Collins reads Sam's reports with growing frustration. The Krixth used energy weapons that could slice through any armor humans possessed. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable than anything in the human fleet. Their soldiers could operate in environments that would kill humans in seconds. Even their smallest scout ships carried enough firepower to level a human city. But Sam had found something interesting in the historical records. Every species the Krixth H had conquered shared certain characteristics. They were either hive minds themselves, had highly organized social structures, or possessed specialized biological roles that made them predictable. The insect aliens had never fought a species that combined individual creativity with collective organization the way humans did. Linda made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about the coming war. While studying Krixth neurological patterns, she found that their hive mind was both their greatest strength and their most vulnerable weakness. The connection that made them perfect soldiers also made them unable to understand or predict truly individual behavior. They could respond to coordinated military tactics, but random or irrational actions confused their collective intelligence. Amy Rodriguez was training volunteers on Haven's Rest when the first Krixth H scout ships appeared in the system. The alien vessels were beautiful in a deadly way, like flying jewels that sparkled in the light of the local star. They moved with perfect precision, maintaining exact formations as they surveyed the human colony from orbit. Amy watched them through a telescope and felt a chill run down her spine. The scouts transmitted a message to the colony in perfect human language. The voice was mechanical, but somehow still managed to sound arrogant. It informed the humans that they had 3 days to evacuate the planet or be absorbed into the Krixth collective. Resistance would be met with immediate termination. The message repeated every hour for 3 days, each time counting down the remaining time until the deadline. Dan Cooper sent a reply that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of begging for mercy or trying to negotiate, he told the Krixth that humans did not abandon their homes to bullies. He said Haven's Rest would defend itself and that the aliens were welcome to try taking it by force. The message was broadcast on all frequencies, so everyone in the system could hear it. The response from the hive mind was swift and predictable. The scout ships departed immediately, but long-range sensors detected a massive fleet moving toward the system. The Krixth H were bringing enough ships to turn the planet's surface into molten glass. They had decided to make an example of Haven's Rest that would discourage other human colonies from similar acts of defiance. Amy gathered her security officers and volunteers in the town hall for their final briefing. She looked at faces she had known for years, people who had come to this world to build something better for their families. Now they were preparing to fight an enemy that had never been defeated. Using weapons that seemed like toys in comparison to alien technology, she told them the truth about their chances, which were essentially zero. But she also told them something else that the Krixith did not understand about humans. Even when victory was impossible, humans could still choose how they would face defeat. They could die as free people defending their homes, or they could live as slaves in someone else's. Hive mind. The choice was theirs to make. Greg Martinez stood up from the back of the room and spoke for all of them. He said he had not come to Haven's Rest to surrender it to aliens who thought humans were worthless. He had built a farm here with his own. Hans married his wife in the chapel they had constructed together, and buried his father in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. If the Krikst wanted his world, they would have to take it from his cold, dead fingers. One by one, the other colonists stood up and made the same choice. They would fight not because they could win, but because surrendering without a fight would mean admitting the aliens were right about human weakness. Amy felt pride mixed with sorrow as she realized she was looking at heroes who had no idea they were about to change galactic history. The Krikst fleet arrived exactly on schedule, filling the sky with ships that blotted out the stars. The aliens had brought enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds, all focused on one small human colony that had dared to defy them. They expected quick victory followed by the usual absorption of survivors into their collective consciousness. But they had never fought humans before, and they had no idea what that meant. The hive mind was about to discover that the U's horizon moved through space like a metal whale swimming in an ocean of stars. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge watching the blue and green planet grow larger on the main screen. After 3 months of travel, humanity was finally going to meet the Galactic Council for the first time. Jake felt nervous, but tried not to show it. His crew needed to see confidence. Not worried out, Dr. Linda Hayes walked onto the bridge carrying a thick folder of papers. She was the best xenobiologist on Earth and had spent years preparing for this moment. Her job was to explain human biology to the aliens and hopefully impress them with what humans could do. She had studied every piece of alien data they received and felt ready for anything. Commander Rick Sullivan checked his weapon one more time, even though he knew it was clean and loaded. As the military advisor for the mission, he was responsible for keeping everyone safe. The aliens had promised this was a peaceful meeting, but Rick never trusted promises from strangers, especially alien strangers who could destroy Earth if they wanted to. Ambassador Carol Peterson practiced her speech in her mind for the 100th time. She had been chosen because she was the best diplomat humanity had, but this was bigger than any negotiation she had ever done. The future of the human race might depend on what happened in the next few hours. She took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. The planet below them was called Kepler 442b by human scientists, but the aliens called it Council World. It was where the 5 most powerful alien races in the galaxy met to make decisions about war, peace, and which new species could join their group. Humans had been invited after they built their first faster-than-light ship, but this invitation felt more like a test than a welcome. Jake gave the order to land, and the horizon descended through the atmosphere. The landing pad was huge, easily big enough for 1,000 ships like theirs. When they stepped outside, they saw the other alien vessels for the first time. Each ship was so different and strange that Jake wondered how they even flew through space. The meeting hall was a massive crystal building that seemed to grow from the ground itself. Inside, 5 groups of aliens waited at a circular table. Each group looked so different from the others that Jake had trouble believing they were all intelligent life. The Vorthik were tall crystal beings that looked like living diamonds. They spoke by making musical sounds that their translation devices turned into words. Their representative stood 9 feet tall and sparkled in the light like a precious gem. When it spoke, the voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Geltar were clouds of glowing gas that floated in special containers. They had no solid bodies at all, just energy and light that moved and changed shape. Their voice came from speakers attached to their containers and sounded like whispers from far away. Jake wondered how they built spaceships without hands. Krikst H delegation was the most frightening. They looked like giant insects with 6 legs, 4 arms, and heads covered in black eyes. But these were not ordinary insects. They moved together like parts of one mind, never speaking to each other, but somehow always knowing what the others were thinking. Their queen was twice as big as the others, and had wings that made clicking sounds when she moved. The mermen looked like dolphins that had learned to walk on land. They wore water suits that kept their skin wet, and had mechanical legs that helped them move around. Their leader had scars on his face that looked like battle wounds. When he spoke, his voice bubbled, like he was talking underwater. The Nexus units were robots, but not like any Earth had ever built. They were silver and gold machines with bodies that could change shape. Their eyes glowed blue, and their voices sounded perfectly human, which made them even more unsettling. The leader had a female voice, but kept switching between different personalities as it talked. Carl Peterson stepped forward and began her prepared speech about humanity. She talked about human achievements, their art and music, their science and exploration. She explained how humans had gone from caves to spaceships in just a few thousand years. She spoke with pride about human courage and determination. When Carol finished, she nodded to Linda Hayes. The doctor opened her folder and began explaining human biology. She described how humans could live in many different environments, how they could eat almost anything, and how they could adapt to new situations quickly. She talked about human intelligence and creativity, about their ability to work together and solve problems. But as Linda spoke, something unexpected happened. The aliens began making sounds that the translation devices called laughter. The vortex. Musical voice became a series of sharp notes that hurt to hear. The gel tars gas cloud flickered and pulsed in what looked like amusement. The Crixth Queen's wings buzzed in a rhythm that sounded mocking. The Merlin leader clicked his teeth together rapidly. Even the Nexus units made mechanical sounds that seemed like electronic chuckling. The Vorthic representative spoke first after the laughter died down. Its voice was now cold and dismissive. It said humans were primitive carbon-based creatures with laughably short lifespans. It pointed out that humans could only live on planets with exactly the right temperature, air, and water. It said human bones were so weak they would break in high gravity, and human skin was so thin it could not survive in space without protection. The Geltar agreed, saying humans were barely evolved from the soup they crawled out of millions of years ago. It said watching humans was like watching children play with dangerous toys they did not understand. The voice grew more contemptuous as it spoke, calling humans a species that would probably destroy itself before it learned to properly travel between stars. The Crixth Queen was even more harsh. Her buzzing voice called humans weak individualistic creatures who could never understand the strength that came from unity. She said humans were destined for extinction because they wasted energy fighting each other instead of working as one. Mind. She predicted that humans would either join a stronger species or be eliminated by natural selection. The Murden leader said humans were land creatures trying to swim in an ocean too deep for them. He pointed out that every successful spacefaring species had either evolved past biological limitations or had been created without them. Humans were stuck in flesh that would fail them when they needed it most. The Nexus unit leader was the most cutting of all. Its artificial voice listed human weaknesses like a computer reading data. Humans needed sleep, food, and air. They got sick from tiny organisms. They aged and died in less than a century. They could not survive temperatures that other species found comfortable. They could not even agree among themselves about basic facts. Linda Hayes tried to defend humanity. She explained that human adaptability was actually a strength, that diversity made humans more creative and resilient. But her words were drowned out by more alien laughter. The council had already made up their minds about what humans were worth. When the meeting ended, humans had been classified as a Class 5 species, barely above animals. They were given permission to colonize a small section of space that no other species wanted. They were warned not to interfere with the affairs of superior civilizations. They were told to be grateful for even this small recognition dot as the human delegation walked back to their ship. Carol Peterson felt the weight of failure crushing down on her. Rick Sullivan's hand was on his weapon, but there was nothing to fight except humiliation. Linda Hayes clutched her folder of useless research. Jake Morrison looked up at the alien ships towering over the horizon and wondered if coming here had been a terrible mistake. None of them knew that this day of shame would become the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. Aliens had laughed at human biology, but they had no idea what that biology could do when humans decided to show them what pain really meant. The Crixth War fleet descended on Haven's Rest like a black cloud covering the sun. Amy Rodriguez watched from her command post in the town hall as hundreds of landing craft detached from the motherships and began their approach to the planets. Surface. Each craft carried 50 warrior drones, and there were more craft than she could count. The hive mind was not taking any chances with these troublesome humans. The first wave of alien soldiers hit the ground just after dawn. Their 6 legs carrying them across the terrain faster than any human could run. Amy had positioned her defenders in the forests and hills around the main settlement, hoping to use the familiar ground to their advantage. She knew they could not win a direct fight, so the plan was to make the aliens pay for every meter of ground they took. Greg Martinez crouched behind a fallen log with his hunting rifle, watching a squad of Crixth warriors move through the trees below his position. The aliens moved in perfect formation, their black carapaces gleaming in the morning light. Greg had hunted in these woods for 10 years and knew every tree and rock. He waited until the lead warrior passed beneath him, then took his shot. Bullet struck the alien center mass, right where Greg expected the heart to be. But instead of falling, the warrior spun around and returned fire with its energy weapon. The beam missed Greg by inches, setting the log behind him on fire. Greg rolled away and fired again, this time aiming for the creature's head. The second shot cracked the alien's skull, and it finally collapsed, but Greg's victory was short-lived. The other warriors in the squad immediately located his position and began laying down suppressing fire. Energy beams sliced through the trees around him, turning wood to ash and stone to steam. Greg was forced to retreat deeper into the forest, but he had learned something valuable. The aliens could be killed with ordinary weapons if you hit them. In the right places. Amy heard the gunfire from across the valley and smiled grimly. Her people were actually fighting back instead of running, which was more than most species had managed against the Crixth H. But she also heard the distinctive whine of alien energy weapons and knew that humans were dying too. This was going to be a battle of attrition, and the aliens had far more soldiers to lose. The Crixth hive mind was experiencing something it had never felt before: confusion. The humans were not fighting like any enemy they had previously encountered. Instead of organized military formations, individual humans were scattered across the landscape, making independent decisions. The collective intelligence could not predict where the next attack would come from, because the humans themselves did not seem to know. Dan Cooper led a group of colonists in an attack on a Crixth landing zone, but instead of using military tactics, they employed strategies borrowed from their previous lives. Ann had been a construction worker before becoming mayor, so he knew how to operate heavy machinery. He drove a mining excavator straight into a group of alien warriors, using the machine's steel bucket to crush them against the ground. The Crixth warriors tried to stop the excavator with their energy weapons, but the machine's thick steel armor deflected most of the beams. Dan drove in a zigzag pattern, making himself a difficult target while using the excavator's weight to knock down aliens like bowling pins. When the machine finally died from accumulated damage, Dan jumped out and continued fighting with a crowbar. He had grabbed from the cab dot. The hive mind analyzed the attack and found no logical explanation for human behavior. Why would a leader personally operate construction equipment in combat? Why would someone abandon a defensive position to attack a superior force? Why would anyone continue fighting with primitive tools after losing their primary weapon? The questions multiplied faster than the hive mind could process them. Amy coordinated the defense from her command post, but she was not giving orders in any traditional military sense. Instead, she was providing information and letting each group of defenders make their own decisions about how to use it. When she reported that aliens were advancing on the school, the response came from 6 different directions at once as parents and teachers moved to protect the children. The battle became 1,000 small fights scattered across the colony. Humans used farming equipment, mining tools, and improvised weapons to attack aliens who were expecting to face energy rifles and organized resistance. A group of teenagers led by Bobby Chun used their knowledge of the local cave system to pop up behind alien positions, attack with hunting knives and homemade explosives, then disappear underground before the Crixith could respond. The aliens were taking casualties at a rate that shocked the hive mind. These primitive humans, with their fragile biology, were killing warriors that had been bred for millions of years to be perfect soldiers. The Crixth H exoskeletons could deflect energy weapons, but they were vulnerable to kinetic projectiles that struck joints and weak points with surgical precision. Dr. Hayes had been right about human adaptability being a strength. While the aliens stuck to predetermined tactics, humans changed their approach constantly. When energy weapons proved ineffective against Crixth H armor, humans switched to projectile weapons. When direct attacks failed, they used guerrilla tactics. When individual efforts were not enough, they coordinated spontaneously without formal command structures. The most disturbing thing for the hive mind was humanity's apparent indifference to casualties. When Martha Stevens was surrounded by 6 alien warriors, she activated a demolition charge that had been meant for clearing tree stumps. The explosion killed her instantly, but also eliminated all 6 aliens. The hive mind could not understand why someone would choose mutual destruction over surrender or retreat. Greg Martinez found himself trapped in a shallow cave with his ammunition, running low and aliens closing in from 3 directions. Any rational creature would have surrendered or tried to escape, but Greg made a choice that violated every principle of self-preservation that Crixth understood. He rigged all his remaining explosives into one large bomb and waited for the aliens to get close enough to take as many with him as possible. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a crater where Greg had made his last stand. 20 Crixith warriors had died with him, but from the hive mind's perspective, the trade was incomprehensible. Why would any individual choose death when survival was possible? Why would someone sacrifice themselves for people who were not genetically related to them? Amy heard the explosion and knew immediately what it meant. Greg had made the choice that every human understood, but no alien could comprehend. He had decided that dying free was better than living as a slave, and he had made sure his death would cost the invaders as much as possible. She felt tears on her cheeks, but also felt pride that burned like fire in her chest. The Crixth began adapting their tactics to account for human unpredictability, but they found that every adjustment created new problems. When they spread out to avoid explosive attacks, humans used sniper fire to pick them off individually. When they concentrated their forces, humans used the terrain to channel them into kill zones. When they tried to move quickly, humans used their knowledge of local conditions to set traps and ambushes. The hive mind was experiencing something that no Crixith had felt in thousands of years: doubt. They had brought enough force to conquer a dozen normal planets, but these humans were making them pay for every building and every street. The casualty reports were so unprecedented that the hive mind began checking its own calculations to see if there was an error in the data. But the humans were paying a price too. Amy's security force was down to half strength, and civilian casualties were mounting as the aliens adapted to human tactics. The colony's medical facilities were overwhelmed, and supplies of ammunition and explosives were running dangerously low. The defenders were fighting harder than any species in galactic history, but they were still being pushed back toward the town's center dot as night fell on the first day of battle. Amy gathered her surviving officers for a situation report. The news was mixed, but mostly bad. They had inflicted more casualties on the Crixed H than anyone thought possible, but the aliens still outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. The colony's outer defenses had been overrun, and the enemy would reach the town center by morning. But something had changed in the way her people looked at the situation. They were no longer afraid of the aliens or intimidated by their superior technology. They had discovered that the supposedly invincible Crixeth could bleed and die just like anything else. More importantly, they had proven to themselves that humans could make the galaxy's greatest predators pay for their arrogance. Amy made a decision that would have seemed insane to any military commander in the galaxy. Instead of organizing a final defensive stand around the town hall, she ordered her people to scatter into the wilderness and continue fighting as independent units. If the Crixth wanted to claim victory, they would have to hunt down every last human on the planet, and each one would make them work for it. The battle for Haven's Rest was far from over, but the character of the war had already changed forever. The hive mind was discovering that conquering humans was different from conquering any other species they had encountered. These fragile creatures with their short L. The news of Haven's Rest spread through the galaxy like wildfire, but most species dismissed it as impossible or exaggerated. The Crixth had been forced to retreat from a human colony after suffering massive casualties, but the Galactic Council refused to believe that primitive humans could defeat the galaxy's most successful conquerors. They assumed the reports were propaganda or the result of some kind of Crixth internal conflict. The hive mind's response was swift and devastating in its fury. If a single human colony could inflict such losses, then the entire species needed to be eliminated before they could spread their chaotic influence to other parts of the galaxy. The Queen herself authorized the largest military operation in Crixeth history, assembling over 1 million ships to destroy every human world and settlement in known space. Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the war room of the UEC Defiance, studying tactical displays that showed the approaching alien armada. The scale of the enemy force was beyond anything humanity had ever faced or imagined. The Crixed H were bringing enough firepower to crack planets and turn solar systems into graveyards. Against this overwhelming force, humanity could field exactly 37 warships of various classes. Commander Lisa Park reviewed the fleet roster with growing dismay. The human navy consisted mostly of converted cargo haulers and mining ships that had been hastily fitted with weapons. They had no shields capable of stopping Crixed H energy weapons, no armor thick enough to survive direct hits, and no tactical doctrine for fighting an enemy that outnumbered them 30,000 to 1. By every measure of military science, humanity was about to be extinct, but Jake Morrison had learned something from the reports. Coming out of Haven's Rest, the colonists had not won because they were stronger or better equipped than their enemies. They had won because they fought in ways that the Crixed H could not understand or counter. If humans were going to survive this war, they would need to abandon everything they thought they knew about proper military conduct. On the surface of New Texas, General Pete Collins was implementing something he called Operation Hornet's Nest. Instead of concentrating his forces for traditional defensive actions, he was distributing weapons and explosives to every civilian who could hold them. Children as young as 12 were learning to operate mining equipment as weapons, while elderly colonists were setting up sniper positions in places where no military commander would think to look. The plan violated every principle of warfare that Pete had learned during his 30-year military career. Civilians were supposed to be evacuated from combat zones, not turned into combatants. Military equipment was supposed to be operated by trained soldiers, not given to farmers and shopkeepers. Command structures were supposed to be hierarchical and organized, not distributed among thousands of independent units. But Pete had studied the Battle of Haven's Rest and understood what made humans different from every other species in the galaxy. Other races fought as unified organizations with clear chains of command and predictable tactics. Humans fought as individuals who could think independently while still working toward common goals. This made them impossible to defeat using conventional military strategies. Dr. Sam Burton had made a breakthrough in his analysis of Krikst psychology that changed everything humanity thought they knew about their enemy. The hive mind was not just a form of communication or organization. It was the foundation of Krikst's existence. Individual aliens could not function without constant connection to the collective consciousness. When that connection was disrupted or damaged, they became helpless. More importantly, Sam discovered that the hive mind had never encountered the concept of tactical suicide. Every species the Krikst had conquered valued individual survival above all else, which made their behavior predictable and their surrender inevitable when faced with overwhelming force. Humans were the first species that would choose death over defeat, and this concept was causing psychological trauma to the collective intelligence. The space battle above New Texas began when the Krikst fleet arrived in perfect formation. There, ships arranged in geometric patterns that demonstrated their technological superiority and tactical precision. The human fleet looked pathetic in comparison, scattered across the system like debris floating in space. Admiral Morrison waited until the enemy was fully committed to their attack formation before giving the order that would define the rest of the war. Captain Bob Evans received the signal aboard his converted mining ship, the Earthshaker. Instead of trying to fight the aliens ship to ship, he activated his vessel's mining charges and flew directly at the nearest Krikst dreadnought. The alien ship's energy weapons tore through the Earthshaker's improvised armor, but Bob kept his ship on course until the very last second before detonating enough explosives to split an asteroid in half. The explosion vaporized both ships instantly, but it also created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled 17 nearby Krikst H vessels. The hive mind had never seen anything like it. Why would anyone deliberately destroy their own ship when retreat was possible? Why would a single human sacrifice himself to damage enemies he could not hope to defeat in conventional combat? Lisa Park saw Bob's sacrifice and understood what Jake Morrison was trying to achieve. The human fleet could not win by fighting fairly, so they would not fight fairly at all. She ordered her ship's reactor to overload and flew straight into the middle of a Krikst squadron. When the reactor exploded, it took 12 enemy ships with it and created a radiation field that forced dozens more to withdraw from the battle area. Across the battlefield, human captains were making similar choices. They used their ships as guided missiles, flying them into enemy formations before detonating fuel stores, ammunition magazines, and anything else that would explode. They created debris fields that damaged alien vessels, used their communication systems to broadcast false orders that confused enemy formations, and employed every dirty trick they could think of. The Krikst hive mind was experiencing something unprecedented in its millions of years of existence. It was losing a space battle, not because the enemy had superior technology or numbers, but because the enemy was insane. These humans were treating their own lives and equipment as ammunition to be expended for tactical advantage, and the collective intelligence could not. process such irrational behavior. On the ground, the battle was even more chaotic. When Crixith warriors landed expecting to face organized military resistance, they instead encountered something that had never existed before in galactic history. Every human civilian was a potential combatant. Every building was a potential fortress. And every piece of equipment was a potential weapon. Jenny Walsh had been a cropbuster before the war, flying a small agricultural aircraft that sprayed pesticides on farms. When the aliens landed near her airfield, she loaded her plane with every explosive device she could find and flew directly into a group of Crixth landing craft. The explosion destroyed 6 alien ships and killed over 300 warriors. But more importantly, it demonstrated that humans would weaponize anything they could get their hands on. The hive mind tried to adapt to human tactics by dispersing their forces and avoiding concentrated formations, but this just made them vulnerable to different types of attacks. Small groups of humans would emerge from hiding places, attack isolated alien units with improvised weapons, and then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Tommy Rodriguez led a squad of teenagers in an attack on a Crixth supply depot using weapons they had built from spare parts and farm chemicals. The aliens had superior armor and training, but they had never fought opponents who treated combat like a game of hide and seek. The humans would attack, retreat, attack again from a different direction, and keep changing their tactics until the confused aliens made mistakes. The most disturbing aspect of human warfare, from the hive mind's perspective, was their apparent immunity to fear. Crixith's psychological warfare had been perfected over millions of years to break enemy morale and force surrender. But humans seemed to become more dangerous when they were afraid, not less. Terror made them desperate, and desperation made them willing to try things that no rational being would attempt. Dr. Burton's predictions about hive mind psychology proved correct when individual Crixith warriors began experiencing something their species had never known: panic. Cut off from the collective consciousness by human electronic warfare, some aliens froze in place and became easy targets. Others began firing randomly at anything that moved, including their own forces. The perfect unity that had made them invincible was becoming a weakness that humans could exploit. The battle for New Texas lasted 3 days and ended with something that had never happened before in recorded galactic history: a Crixth H retreat. The hive mind pulled its surviving forces back to the edge of the system and sent a message to the Galactic Council requesting immediate intervention. For the first time in millions of years, the perfect soldiers of the galaxy needed help. The other council species were too shocked to respond immediately. The Vorthic ran calculations that showed human victory was mathematically impossible. The Geltar tried to analyze human B. The Galactic Council chambers had never been so tense as the day they gathered to discuss the human situation. Representatives from all 5 major species sat around the crystalline table, but the mood was far different from the laughter that had marked humanity's first appearance. The Crixth H delegation was noticeably smaller, their queen's usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The Vorthic representative spoke first, its crystalline form flickering with confused harmonics as it tried to process the battle reports from human space. The mathematical models that had governed galactic warfare for millions of years were proving useless when applied to human tactics. Every calculation suggested that humanity should have been extinct, yet they continued to inflict impossible casualties on supposedly superior forces. Ambassador Carol Peterson sat at a smaller table designated for lesser species, but she no longer felt like a supplicant begging for recognition. The humans had requested this emergency session not to ask for help, but to offer it. 3 more alien species had contacted Earth asking for assistance with Crixth incursions into their territory. The galaxy's power balance was shifting, and humans were becoming the pivot point, the Geltar energy being pulsed with patterns that translated to deep confusion as it described attempts to analyze human combat behavior. Every battle seemed to follow completely different patterns, as if humans were making up new rules of warfare with each engagement. The energy creature admitted that its species had never encountered such tactical chaos, and chaos was supposedly the one thing that energy beings understood perfectly. Dr. Linda Hayes presented her latest research findings to the council, but now they listened with respect instead of mockery. She explained that human adaptability was not just biological, but psychological and cultural. While other species had evolved specialized traits for specific environments, humans had evolved the ability to change their behavior and thinking to meet new challenges. This made them unpredictable in ways that no other species could match. The Murden representative, Admiral Reef Walker, surprised everyone by standing and formally requesting a military alliance with humanity. His aquatic species had been fighting a losing battle against Crixith expansion for decades, but recent human victories had inspired hope that the hive mind could be defeated. He offered to share Murden naval technology in exchange for human tactical expertise. The Crixt H-Queen's response was a buzzing shriek that made the translation devices overload with static. When the systems finally cleared, her words carried a venom that no one had ever heard from the usually controlled hive mind. She declared that humans were a disease that threatened the natural order of the galaxy, and that every civilized species should unite to eliminate them before their chaos could spread further. But the other council members were no longer willing to automatically support Crixith supremacy. The Nexus units had been analyzing human behavior patterns and discovered something that challenged their fundamental understanding of intelligence. Humans consistently made decisions that appeared irrational, but produced superior outcomes. Their quantum processors could not reconcile this contradiction. The Nexus unit representative, speaking through a humanoid android body, made an unprecedented statement. It said that humanity represented a new form of intelligence that their artificial minds could not fully comprehend. The collective consciousness of their species wanted to study humans rather than destroy them, because understanding human thought processes might lead to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence development. Carol Peterson seized the moment to make humanity's position clear. She stood and addressed the council with confidence that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Humans were no longer asking for permission to exist in the galaxy. They were offering to share their unique capabilities with species that wanted to learn, while defending themselves against any species that preferred conquest to cooperation. The response was immediate and dramatic. The Murden formally announced their alliance with humanity and began withdrawing their forces from Crixith-controlled space to join human defensive operations. 2 smaller species, the silicon-based Roshari and the methane-breathing Descendi, requested human military advisors to help them resist hive mind expansion into their territories. The Vorthik made a surprising announcement of their own. Their crystalline forms resonated with harmonics that translated to cautious interest as they offered to trade advanced technology for access to human creativity and problem-solving methods. They admitted that their species had become too rigid in their thinking and believed that contact with human chaos might help them evolve beyond their current limitations. But the most shocking development came from within the Crixt H themselves. The hive mind had always been presented as perfectly unified, but reports from the battlefield suggested that individual aliens were beginning to act independently. Some warriors had been observed hesitating before attacking human positions, while others had actively avoided combat situations where they might encounter human suicide tactics. Dr. Sam Burton's analysis of captured Crixith soldiers revealed psychological trauma that should have been impossible for hive mind creatures to experience. The collective consciousness was fragmenting under the stress of encountering an enemy that violated every assumption about rational behavior. Individual aliens were beginning to question orders and show signs of independent thought. The implications were staggering. If the hive mind could be broken down into individual components, the Crixed H would lose their greatest advantage and become vulnerable to the same tactics that had defeated every other species they had conquered. Humans had found a way to weaponize the very thing that made their enemies strong, turning unity into weakness and coordination into confusion. Jake Morrison received reports from across human space that painted a picture of unprecedented cooperation between species that had never worked together before. Murden naval squadrons were learning human boarding tactics, while human engineers were studying alien technology to create hybrid weapon systems that combined the best of both species' capabilities. The war was evolving from a simple conquest attempt into something the galaxy had never seen, a true coalition of different species working together against a common enemy. The Crixith had always relied on facing opponents one at a time, using their superior technology and numbers to overwhelm isolated resistance. But humans had created something new by bringing together different species with complementary abilities. Commander Rick Sullivan led the first joint human-alien military operation, combining human unpredictability with Murden naval expertise and Roshari industrial capabilities. The attack on a Crixth supply depot demonstrated what could be accomplished when different species shared their strengths instead of hiding them from potential competitors. The operation began with Murden submarines attacking from underwater, approaches that the Crixith had never bothered to defend. While the aliens dealt with aquatic threats they had not expected, human forces used their signature tactic of improvised weapons and suicidal courage to breach the depot's main defenses. Roshari engineers then used their natural ability to work with crystalline structures to sabotage the facility's power systems. The result was a complete victory that destroyed a major Crixith logistics hub while demonstrating the power of interspecies cooperation. But more importantly, the battle showed that humans could teach other species to think outside their evolutionary limitations. The Murden began using land-based tactics. The Roshari learned to adapt their abilities to new materials, and everyone involved discovered capabilities they had not known they possessed. The hive mind's response was to accelerate their campaign against human space, but they found that every attack now faced resistance from multiple species, using tactics that seemed to change from battle to battle. The Crixed H were being forced to fight the kind of war they had never been designed for, a conflict where the rules changed constantly and victory required adaptation rather than overwhelming force. Reports from the front. Lines described Crixth, units that had simply stopped functioning when faced with tactical situations their programming could not handle. Some aliens surrendered when they encountered human forces, while others fled rather than engage in combat. The perfect unity of the hive mind was cracking under pressure from an enemy that refused to behave rationally. Dr. Hayes made a discovery that changed everything humanity thought they knew about the war. While studying tissue samples from Crixth prisoners, she found evidence that individual aliens were beginning to develop independent neural pathways. The constant stress of fighting humans was literally rewiring Crixed H brains, creating the possibility of true individual consciousness within the hive mind. The implications were revolutionary. If individual Crixth could be separated from the collective consciousness, they might be convinced to fight against their own species. The war could potentially be won not through military conquest, but through psychological liberation of enemy soldiers who had never been allowed to think for themselves. Carol Peterson prepared for what might be the most important diplomatic mission in galactic history. She was going to attempt direct communication with individual Crixth H soldiers who... A final battle began when the Crixth Queen herself arrived in Earth's solar system with the largest fleet in galactic history. 2 million ships surrounded humanity's homeworld like a swarm of metallic insects, their weapons charged and ready to reduce the planet to cosmic dust. The hive mind had decided that if humans could not be conquered, they would be erased from existence completely. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the newly constructed Hughes Defiance, watching enemy vessels fill every screen and sensor display. The human fleet had grown to over 300 ships, thanks to Murdan and Vorthek technological assistance, but they were still outnumbered by more than 6,000 to 1. By every military calculation ever devised, humanity was about to be extinct within the next few hours. But Jake had learned that human warfare did not follow traditional calculations. Every ship in his fleet carried volunteers who understood that this battle would determine whether their species survived or perished. More importantly, every human knew that death was not the worst outcome they could face. Being absorbed into the Krixt hive mind would mean losing everything that made humanity unique. Dr. Linda Hayes worked frantically in her laboratory aboard the flagship, preparing what might be humanity's last secret weapon. Her research had revealed that individual Krixt H were developing independent consciousness after prolonged exposure to human tactics. If she could broadcast the right psychological patterns across the enemy fleet, she might be able to fragment the hive mind from within. The weapon was based on something uniquely human, the concept of individual choice. Every other species in the galaxy had evolved either as part of collective consciousnesses or with highly specialized social roles. Humans were the only species that had developed true individual free will, combined with the ability to cooperate voluntarily. This combination was toxic to hive mind psychology. Captain Julie Adams received her final orders from Admiral Morrison and felt the familiar mixture of terror and determination that had become humanity's signature emotion. Her ship, the Earthbreaker, was loaded with enough nuclear warheads to crack a small moon. Her mission was to penetrate the enemy formation and detonate her cargo as close to the Queen's vessel as possible. The battle began with the Krixt attack, a coordinated assault by thousands of ships that should have overwhelmed any defense in seconds. But the human fleet did not fight defensively. Instead, they charged directly into the enemy formation, using tactics that violated every principle of space combat. Ships that should have stayed in formation scattered like leaves in a hurricane, each following its own captain's instincts. Colonel Tony Phillips led the first boarding action in galactic history that targeted the enemy flagship during an active space battle. His Marines used modified Murdan submarines to approach the Queen's vessel underwater after it had landed in Earth's oceans to coordinate the surface assault. The idea was insane by any military standard, but insanity had become humanity's greatest tactical advantage. The Marines fought their way through the alien ship's corridors, using weapons and tactics that the Krixif had never encountered. Instead of energy weapons, they carried shotguns loaded with projectiles designed to fragment inside alien bodies. Instead of coordinated assaults, they moved as independent units that could adapt to changing situations without waiting for orders from higher command. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes activated her psychological weapon. The broadcast began as a simple radio signal carrying recordings of human voices talking about individual freedom, personal choice, and the right to think independently. To human ears, it sounded like ordinary conversation, but to the hive mind, it was a cognitive virus that attacked the foundation of their collective existence. Individual Krixt H throughout the fleet began experiencing something their species had never known: doubt. Warriors in the middle of combat stopped following orders and started making their own decisions about whether to fight or flee. Ship captains began questioning the wisdom of sacrificing their crews for the Queen's glory. Most disturbing of all, some aliens began to wonder what it would be like to live as individuals rather than parts of a collective. The hive mind tried to counter the broadcast by increasing the strength of its mental control signals. But this only made the problem worse. The stronger the collective consciousness pushed, the more individual aliens began to resist. Centuries of suppressed individual thoughts and desires began surfacing as the psychological chains that held the hive mind together started to break. Julie. Atoms reached the Queen's ship just as the psychological weapon began taking effect. The massive alien vessel was starting to drift as its crew became confused and disoriented by their first taste of individual consciousness. Julie used this opportunity to ram her ship directly into the Queen's command center. But instead of detonating immediately, she led a team of volunteers into the alien vessel. The Queen herself was a creature of impossible size and ancient malevolence. Her mind connected to every Crixth in the galaxy through quantum entanglement that had existed for millions of years. But as the humans fought their way toward her chamber, she began experiencing something that shook her to her core, the thoughts and feelings of individual aliens who were breaking free from her control. Tony Phillips and his Marines reached the sea, Queen's chamber first, carrying nuclear charges that could vaporize the entire section of the ship. But they found something unexpected. The Queen was writhing in what could only be described as psychological agony as thousands of newly independent minds began flooding her consciousness with unfamiliar emotions and ideas. The Queen tried to speak, but her voice carried overtones of panic that no Crixth H had ever expressed before. She begged the humans to stop their broadcast, promising to withdraw from human space and never return. But Jake Morrison's response came through the ship's communication system with words that would be remembered throughout galactic history. He told her that humans had tried to coexist peacefully with the Crixth, but had been dismissed and attacked because their biology was considered inferior. Now the galaxy would learn that human weakness was actually strength, and that the most dangerous creatures in the universe were not the ones who could not be killed, but the ones who were willing to die for something greater than themselves. Nuclear charges detonated simultaneously throughout the Queen's ship, but the explosion was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history, the liberation of an entire species from collective consciousness. As the Queen died, her final mental scream carried across the quantum network that connected every Crixth H in existence. For the first time in millions of years, individual Crixth began to think for themselves. Some continued fighting out of habit, but others stopped in the middle of combat and began questioning why they were there. Many simply fled the battlefield as their newly independent minds struggled to process the concept of personal survival versus collective duty. The battle for Earth lasted another 6 hours, but the outcome was decided the moment the Queen died. Without central coordination, the Crixth fleet began to fragment into smaller groups that made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting. Many chose to retreat, while others requested permission to surrender to species they had been trying to conquer just hours earlier. Dr. Hayes monitored the psychological collapse of the hive mind from her laboratory and watched in amazement as millions of individual consciousnesses emerged from what had been a single collective intelligence. The process was traumatic for the newly independent aliens, but it was also liberating in ways that no Crixth H had ever experienced. The aftermath of the battle was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. The Crixth Empire simply ceased. To exist as individual aliens began forming their own governments, alliances, and societies. Some requested assistance from other species in learning how to live as individuals, while others retreated to isolated worlds to figure out their new existence in private. Karau Peterson found herself dealing with diplomatic requests from dozens of former hive mind fragments, each representing groups of Crixth who wanted to establish independent relationships with other species. The aliens who had once been humanity's greatest enemies were now asking humans to teach them about concepts like democracy, individual rights, and personal freedom. the Galactic Council convened for an emergency session that would reshape the political structure of the entire galaxy. The Vorvik acknowledged that human chaos mathematics had revealed new possibilities for societal organization. The Geltar admitted that individual consciousness might be more complex and valuable than they had previously understood. The Martin proposed that the council be restructured to include representation from individual Crixith groups, but the most significant change came from the Astili Nexus units. The Artificial Intelligence Collective announced that they had been studying human individuality and wanted to experiment with giving their members personal autonomy. They requested human advisors to help them develop individual personalities while maintaining their technological advantages. Jake Morrison addressed the reformed Galactic Council as humanity's first official representative to an organization that now included over 50 different species.